The prestige that now attached to the papacy as a result of the victory of the Christian Crusaders in the First Crusade was not enough to simply end the investiture controversy once and for all. That still had to play itself out in the first couple of decades of the 12th century. The investiture controversy being the name given by historians to the rejection by the popes of the placing of the ring and the crozier on the bishop's hand and in the bishop's hand at his consecration by the emperor in Germany, which was seen as crucial by the emperor there for his position of control over Germany, but was seen as completely unacceptable by the popes. However, the Pope immediately after the First Crusade, Pope Paschal II, would capitulate on this point to the shock of the rest of Western Europe. He tried to negotiate a deal with the son of Henry IV, Henry V. There was a quarrel in the last years of his life between Henry IV and his son, and Henry V, in the hope of prevailing in his quarrel with his father, promised great things in terms of conforming to the Gregorian reform movement to the popes. But once his father was successfully deposed and then shortly after died, and Henry V was installed as German king and then later emperor, he completely reneged on all the undertakings which he'd made to the popes. In the course of organising his coronation in Rome, riots began to break out, partly because of an agreement which Pope Paschal II suggested, whereby the emperor would repudiate the power of investiture, but in exchange, control over all the lands of the church would go to the emperor. This was seen by the Romans as a complete capitulation that would lead to the total domination of the church by the emperor, and therefore they took to the streets. In the course of the violence that followed, the coronation had to be interrupted, and the Pope was taken hostage, essentially, by the Emperor Henry V. Henry V then forced Paschal into not only conceding imperial control over the church's lands, but also allowing the emperors to continue investing the bishops with ring and crozier. This was seen as such an important point that he was actually accused of having fallen into heresy for having conceded this to the emperor, most famously by St. Bruno of Segni, who was Bishop of Segni and also Abbot of Monte Cassino, the greatest of all Benedictine monasteries, because the one where Benedict himself was buried. Eventually, Paschal II repudiated the agreement which he had come to with the emperor, but not after a great deal of pressure and denunciation from other idealists and reformers in the Western Church. The situation would finally be resolved in the year 1122 by Pope Gelasius II. He agreed with the emperor what's called the Concordat of Worms, spelt worms, whereby there would be a separate ceremony of homage by German bishops to the emperor for their temporal possessions, but the emperors would desist from involving themselves in the sacramental consecration of the bishops. They would no longer put the ring on the finger of the bishop or hand him the crozier. This compromise solution was then ratified by the First Lateran Ecumenical Council in 1123. 1123 is a watershed moment, therefore, in the history of the Church. All 8 ecumenical councils that had been held up to that point had been held in the East. They had all been summoned by the emperor, and the Pope had only been in the same town as the council once, and that was Pope Vigilius, who was in Constantinople during the Second Council of Constantinople, but if you remember from that video, he refused to attend the Second Council of Constantinople. So for a council to be held in the Pope's own cathedral, the Basilica of St. John Lateran, summoned by the Pope himself and presided over by the Pope, was a sign of the new assertiveness of the papacy and the independence of Latin Christendom relative to the East. Now, many later Easterners who adhered to the schism have objected to this practice of calling ecumenical councils in the West. They can't obviously object simply to the fact of having a council in the West. but they have objected that it didn't have all of the 5 patriarchs present. Now, in fact, there are more than 5 patriarchs in the church, but there were 5 patriarchs that were in the Roman Empire in the time of the Emperor Justinian, and so he had referred to this pentarchy, this set of 5 patriarchs, in some of his legislative enactments. But really, this idea of a veto of the patriarchal sees, or even just the patriarchal sees that were in the Roman Empire in the 6th century, doesn't really have any foundation in Scripture. There's clearly a scriptural foundation for the primacy of St. Peter, and there's a scriptural foundation for the apostles. There's the bishops as the successors of the apostles. And of course, we know from the history of the church that some of these sees were particularly associated with the apostles and have ended up as the highest ranking sees within the different ritual traditions. But there's no real mention of the office of patriarch as such in Scripture. So it's very hard to argue that it's part of the divine constitution of the church that the 5 sees that happen to be patriarchates inside the Roman Empire in the 6th century have some sort of veto over the calling of an ecumenical council. So the Acts of Lateran I, important in themselves, the ratification of the Concordat of Worms and various disciplinary canons, are pale really into insignificance compared to the fact that such a council was held by a pope on his own initiative in the West in his own cathedral, a great turning point in the history of the church. Now, this didn't mean that tension was altogether drained out of relations between the temporal and the spiritual power. It would go on, and in fact, a very famous incident of it would flare up in the year 1170, when the Archbishop of Canterbury, St. Thomas Becket, was murdered by knights in the service of King Henry II of England. It's always remained obscure as to whether Henry II actually told them to murder him or whether or not they misinterpreted a remark that he made. But there was a very serious and long-lived conflict between the Archbishop of Canterbury and the king over the subjection of clergy to the king's courts, because the ecclesiastical hierarchy being a parallel sovereign power to the lay rulership in Latin Christendom, clergy and bishops were seen as immune from both taxation and from the courts of the temporal rulers, and so attempts to cross that barrier were deeply offensive to the papacy and to the adherents of the Gregorian reform movement. This had caused a flare-up of conflict between the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had previously been a friend and minister of Henry II, but conformed himself to the Gregorian reform movement after he was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, and in response to his murder, Becket himself was canonized, and Henry II was forced to perform humiliating public penance for having been, in some respect, responsible for this death. Again, as with the Concordat of Worms, the actual dispute ended up being settled by a kind of compromise, but the cult of Thomas Becket, which became the most prominent shrine of pilgrimage in England and a very significant pilgrimage destination for the whole of Western Christendom, became an embodiment of the ideals for which Gregory VII and Leo IX and Urban II had been fighting. The First Crusade led to the establishment of 4 different Crusader States, as they're called, in the East. Originally, these territories were supposed to be given back to the Byzantine Emperor, but because of Alexius turning back and leaving the Crusaders at Antioch, instead they established Latin states of their own. The Holy Land in general was ruled over by the Latin King of Jerusalem. Initially, the government of that territory was given to Godfrey of Bouillon, but then he died only a year after the capture of Jerusalem, and so it went to his brother Baldwin. The city of Edessa was actually captured by the Crusaders on their way to Jerusalem, and that became the county of Edessa. And Antioch was captured after that great siege where Alexios had turned back, and that became the Principality of Antioch, ruled over by Bohemond, a Norman from southern Italy. And finally, Tripoli was captured by Count Raymond of Toulouse, who was one of the foremost leaders of the original assault on Jerusalem, and that became the last of the Crusader States, the county of Tripoli. Unfortunately, these states really only lasted intact for about 100 years because they were not integrated into the Byzantine Empire as Urban II had intended. Therefore, they lacked the necessary strategic hinterland to be able to be preserved indefinitely against Islamic counterattack. The first one to fall was Edessa, and this triggered the Second Crusade, which was an attempt to rescue Edessa and bolster the security of the Crusader States. The Second Crusade, despite the fact that the King of France and the King of England both went on it, was not very successful. In fact, the Holy Roman Emperor-elect went on it as well, the King in Germany. But it was significant for a number of other reasons. On their way there, some English knights liberated Lisbon, which then later became the capital of Portugal, as part of the Reconquista, the Great War of 700 years to reconquer Spain from Islam. But also it was important because of the man who preached the Second Crusade in Western Europe, and this was Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was a Cistercian. The Cistercians were a new type of monk who followed the rule of St. Benedict like the Cluniac monks did, but they wore white habits. The most distinctive difference between them and the Cluniacs, they were founded, the Abbey of Citeaux itself, their mother house was founded during the First Crusade in 1098. Their most significant difference was that whereas Cluny concentrated so much on the liturgy, that they really didn't have time to perform manual labour, and the manual labour necessary to maintain their farms and to provide food for the monastery was undertaken by serfs who were attached to the land that Cluny owned, whereas Citeaux, the monks laboured on their own land, as the rule of St. Benedict envisaged. So really the founding of Citeaux was a moment of eclipse, the beginning of a decline for Cluny, because Citeaux was perceived to be a more idealistic location, a more idealistic form of monastic life than Cluny itself, and so there was a little bit of bad feeling between the three great founders of Clairvaux, Alberic, Stephen Harding, and Robert of Molesme, and the abbots of Cluny. Bernard of Clairvaux belonged to the second generation of Cistercians. Clairvaux was a different monastery, but he was incredibly successful. Many people became monks as a result of his influence, and he lent his prestige to the preaching of the Second Crusade, which meant that it was very successful in terms of recruitment. He was rather shaken by its lack of success on the ground militarily. One of the interesting features of his preaching the Crusade was, though, a great emphasis on the importance of no harm coming to the Jewish people. St. Bernard is a particularly strong witness to the Church's opposition to anti-Semitism. Of course, because Judaism is the religion from which Christianity comes, to slightly simplify matters, there's necessarily a theological tension between Judaism and Christianity. They can't both be true. But the popes in general, not without exception, but in general have been strong in their desire to prevent the persecution of the Jews, and Bernard was very much central to this tradition, whereas lay rulers have more often given in to sectional hatreds or just opportunism, stealing the property of the Jews in Western Europe on the back of cultural and religious bad feeling between the two communities. The second half of the 12th century was marked in Italy particularly by a long drawn-out conflict between the Emperor Frederick I, Frederick Barbarossa, and Pope Alexander III. Alexander III was defending the independence of the city-states of northern Italy, which were nominally part of the Holy Roman Empire, but which essentially ruled themselves as little republics. the emperor wanted to properly incorporate them into his territory, but that would mean that he had direct military power just next to the papal states, and which was not something the popes wanted to see. And so the popes became great defenders of the liberties of the Italian city-states, and eventually managed to force Barbarossa to a compromise known as the Peace of Venice, where he allowed them to continue autonomously, and this would have very significant implications for the later history of the Church. In the middle of the 12th century, the Emperor Manuel I Komnenos in Constantinople had another go at trying to integrate the Crusaders with the structures of the Byzantine East, and he got quite far. He himself married a Latin princess. He had his heir marry a Latin princess. He held jousting tournaments in Constantinople, which must have been quite a sight, and he had the Crusader rulers swear fealty to him, and he tried to assume the position of the leader of the Crusaders, which Urban II had originally had in mind for his predecessor Alexius I Comnenus. Unfortunately, Manuel's own military expeditions were not successful. He was not able to win a great victory against the Turks, and despite his rather interesting and open-minded suggestion to the Pope that he might come to Rome and be crowned emperor there in place of Frederick I Barbarossa, reversing the translation of the empire from the Greeks to the Germans, which had occurred in 800 AD, his military expeditions in Italy were not sufficiently successful for that to become a realistic prospect. So Manuel had the kind of ideals that might have turned the corner on the estrangement between the East and the West, but unfortunately he wasn't able to deliver on his military ambitions in order to fulfill them. When Manuel died, his son was deposed and subsequently murdered by a very unpleasant relative of theirs, Andronicus I Comnenus. And like Cerularius before him, Andronicus decided to marshal anti-Latin feeling in Constantinople in order to put himself at the head of a populist movement and seize the throne. Andronicus, however, actually succeeded in doing this, whereas Cerularius hadn't. Andronicus initiated his grab for power with what was known as the Massacre of the Latins, a raid on all ethnically Western groups inside the Byzantine Empire, and as the name suggests, a murder of vast numbers of them. This greatly poisoned relations between the Easterners and the Westerners and destroyed the attempted rapprochement between the Crusaders and the Byzantines, which Manuel I had taken such strides to achieve. Eventually Andronicus himself was deposed and killed very brutally in the Hippodrome in Constantinople, but it was too late to undo the damage which his actions had inflicted upon Eastern-Western relations. It was therefore with some inevitability, just a few years later at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, that the Crusader armies were surrounded, isolated and defeated by the newly resurgent Muslim ruler Saladin. The relic of the True Cross was lost to the Muslims. That larger single piece of the relic of the True Cross was never subsequently recovered, despite the Crusaders' best efforts. And a few months later, Jerusalem itself fell back into Islamic hands. It's said, with what reliability is unclear, that the then Pope Urban III was so shocked by this news that he died of a heart attack. It led to the summoning of the Third Crusade, led by the most prestigious of all the Western rulers, the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa himself, King Philip II of France, and King Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart. Now, Philip II of France was not a particularly impressive military figure. He only stayed on the crusade for a short period, while the city of Acre on the coast of the Holy Land was recaptured in order to shore up the maritime links of the residuum of the Kingdom of Jerusalem with the states of Latin Christendom. Frederick Barbarossa, unfortunately, he was a very great military commander. He died possibly of a heart attack on his way across Asia Minor and fell into a river and drowned. And that caused a great dislocation among the German Crusaders. many of whom returned home quite quickly. So the result was that although it was still a significant army, it was nothing as big as it might have been, the army of the Third Crusade, but it did have the greatest single military commander of its age at its head, and that was King Richard the Lionheart, Richard I of England. And he won a series of incredibly dramatic victories along the entire coast of the Holy Land, all of which he reconquered for the Crusaders, to the great frustration of Saladin. Richard the Lionheart was 6'7", which was essentially, in modern terms, 9 feet tall, as far as people are concerned in the 12th century, when the average height was much, much lower. He was an incredible, a god of war, he was described as by the historian Gibbon. People were physically terrified of him. So not only was he a brilliant general, but he was absolutely terrifying on the battlefield. At one point during one battlefield, he was simply charging around in the midst of the enemy ranks, smashing people's heads off with a battle axe, easy to surround and overcome, but everyone was too terrified of him. No one would come anywhere near him, despite the furious orders of Saladin from the sidelines. However, Jerusalem was not recaptured. The reason for this is that there was simply not enough troops left in the Holy Land. Richard the Lionheart got to within sight of Jerusalem. It's said that he refused to look at it because he knew that he couldn't make an assault on it. He told the other Crusaders that he would be able to capture Jerusalem if they attacked it, but that he would have to use all their forces to do so, and then he'd have to use them to garrison the Holy City, which would mean that the coastal cities which he'd reconquered would be left defenseless and immediately recaptured by the Muslims, and therefore Jerusalem would be surrounded and taken back almost immediately, and therefore it was militarily pointless to try and take Jerusalem at this point, which is why he wouldn't look at it. He said if the Crusaders wanted to try the assault anyway, then he was happy to resign and fight in the ranks as just an ordinary soldier under some other commander, but he could not in conscience advise an assault on the city itself. And so the very disappointed Crusaders decided not to elect a different commander. They stayed with Richard, and Richard went back to the west in order to try and shore up his dominions, which had been attacked, contrary to the rules of crusading, by Philip II of France after his return to the west. Richard intended to shore up his territories and then return with a larger army to complete the reconquest of the Holy Land. Unfortunately, that didn't happen because he was shot dead by a crossbow bolt during his campaigns in northern France. The death of Frederick Barbarossa left his son Henry VI as the Holy Roman Emperor. He had married the heiress to the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, which meant that he was now the nominal sovereign of northern Italy and the actual ruler of southern Italy, which placed the popes in an extremely dangerous situation. However, Henry VI died unexpectedly early, leaving his infant son, Frederick II, as the heir to all these territories. And because Sicily was a subject kingdom of the Holy See, the Pope himself was the guardian of this infant's future emperor, which put him in a very difficult situation because he really didn't want to see this young man ruling as both Germany and Italy, because that would greatly weaken the papacy. And the developments which resulted from the widespread dominions and the pincer position of the young Frederick II is something which belongs to the subject of the 13th century. One last point before we move on from the 12th century is Laudabilita, the bull of 1155, issued by Pope Adrian IV, the only English pope ever to have sat upon the throne of St. Peter. This bull, the authenticity of which some historians have denied, but which a majority of historians accept to be genuine, in past lordship over the Kingdom of Ireland to King Henry II of England, this very fateful moment, Ireland had already begun to be, for want of a better word, colonised by Norman knights and other aristocrats who were now ruling England since the Norman conquest. So they weren't actually English, they were French-speaking aristocrats who decided, as the Normans did all over the place, that they'd take a go at conquering Ireland as well. And so this general movement was confirmed by this bull of the Pope, which said that because the Irish had been unable to establish a firm central government, and this was damaging the church, that he was therefore giving lordship over the Kingdom of Ireland, whose high kingship had been vacant for too long, in his view, to King Henry II of England. And this is the reason why Ireland was subject to the sovereignty of the King of England for the remainder of the Middle Ages. Until the Reformation, however, the English king never assumed the title King of Ireland because he hadn't been given that position by the Pope, which was intended to imply a sort of provisionality to the arrangement. It wouldn't be until Henry VIII broke with Rome in the 16th century that he usurped the title King of Ireland and claimed actual direct and full sovereignty over Ireland. And from that point onwards, the situation became much more fraught because Ireland remained Catholic, whereas the King of England fell into Protestantism. But that, of course, is a subject for many centuries hence.